It is January 23rd, 2025, and the newly re-inaugurated President Trump is in Davos at the World Economic Forum, where he's saying quite a lot, but also specifically saying that he hopes to meet with Russian President Putin soon for talks aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. But as we've seen this week, Trump has made a number of threats towards Putin, right? He's threatened him with more sanctions if they don't come to a deal. He seems to kind of be going back and forth on exactly what tactic he is pursuing at the moment. And I've heard from several of you that you think that this is just a tactic, that this is just how Trump operates, and that at the end of the day, maybe there's already a deal, right? Maybe something has already been decided upon. Now, I'm not quite that optimistic, I will say. I think that Russia, Putin especially, is going to be much more of a hardliner given everything that the West has put Russia through up until this point, given the fact that they know that the West is not remotely trustworthy when it comes to the possibility of making a deal and then following through on it. So I'm a little bit less optimistic as I'm watching Trump's statements, but I'm also curious what those talks are going to look like, when they're going to happen, because Trump seems to think that he just needs to get Zelensky and Putin in a room together and tell them to figure it out. And he's not paying attention to just how involved the United States has been at every single step of this war, at making the war in Ukraine possible. It would not be where it is today, or really possible at all like it has been, without the overwhelming support of the US, literally propping up Kiev's government and military. So today I was able to have a conversation about the current situation there with a special guest who previously would join me often when I anchored for RT America. It feels like so long ago now. It really wasn't that long ago, but for about 3.5, almost 4 years, I worked for RT America in Washington, D.C. I was a reporter, an anchor, and also a talk show co-host for a little bit there. And it's so cool to look back on how many of the people I was able to meet there, how many guests I was able to meet that I still get to talk to and to welcome back onto this version of my program today. And so we got to have a version of that, a little mini reunion today. And I'm so excited for y'all to get to listen to it. So let's get into that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Jim Jatras, a geopolitical analyst and a former U.S. diplomat and GOP Senate foreign policy advisor. Jim, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Rachel, it's really great to be back with you. It's like old times. I really enjoy the invitation.
Yeah, I know we've had a lot of conversations on RT America back in the day, and so I'm glad that I
Yeah.
get to talk to you again. And yet, even when we look back, that was a few years ago, we're still dealing with some of the same issues, which in this case have kind of blown up, and that is, of course, surrounding Ukraine. And you've got President Trump, he's right back into office. Both he and Russian President Putin have indicated that they want to meet. They want to have talks about the war in Ukraine. But instead of waiting for that meeting, Trump hasn't been able to really stop talking since he returned to the White House. And in a ranting paragraph posted on Truth Social on Wednesday, he called on Putin to, quote, stop this ridiculous war, threatening that it's only going to get worse, and then saying that he would add in, taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on Russia. So how do you see that statement from Trump, and how could it affect talks with the Russian president?
Well, I have to agree 100% with the statement you posted a few hours ago on X and your site that took him to task for that. It's just utterly bizarre. He seems to be totally misinformed about what's going on in Russia. They've lost 1 million men. Their economy is in tatters, and so on and so forth. Um, Let me put the best possible face I can on this. And again, pure speculation. Maybe this is just for domestic consumption. Maybe this is his way of looking hairy-chested. I forced Putin to come to the table, blah, blah, blah. And what he really intends is then to go meet with him and come to terms with the realities of the war. I don't think that's the case, but I'm clutching at straws here. I'm hoping that's the best possible interpretation. I think the bigger problem is that he is woefully misinformed about what's going on. I'm hoping if Tulsi Gabbard gets in as director of national intelligence, she can start giving him the straight dope about what the situation is. I think the bigger problem, though, is, and this is something I tried to spell in that piece that was on the Ron Paul site about a month ago, is that my concern in some ways is less about what the Americans are going to do next than what the Russians are going to do next. Are they still entertaining the fantasy that some kind of a reasonable agreement could be made with Washington, Trump or no Trump? And I just don't think that's possible. I mean, it just seems to me that even if Trump goes in with the best of intentions of recognizing the fact that the Russians have won this war, and their legitimate security concerns have to be addressed, can he actually make the American government follow through with that? Can he actually shake a hand and make an agreement and have the United States stick to that agreement? And that's what I'm really concerned about, is that in Moscow they're still entertaining this fantasy that, oh, at some point they're going to wake up and smell the kvass and come to the table and make an agreement. And I just don't see that happening, especially with the kind of people Trump has around him.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's interesting too, because of course, even if Trump comes to the table and he says, all right, Putin, we're going to, give you what you want in a number of different areas, Trump still is only in office for 4 years. So there's no guarantee, even if we do have 4 years of peace, there's no guarantee that you don't have another version of Biden, Blinken, other members from his administration that come back in, Republican or Democrat, and that try to turn attentions with Russia again. Now, I want to highlight one point you made about the possibility of Trump putting this out there for domestic consumption, because referencing that article that you published with the Ron Paul Institute last month, which I'll link in the description below, in it you noted that Trump campaigned heavily on the promise that he would end the war in Ukraine, and that many Americans, even a lot of whom never much cared for Donald Trump, voted for him in part because they believed, or at least hoped, that he would be, relatively speaking, a peace candidate compared to the hideous Biden-Harris record. So when it comes to what we're hearing from Trump now, I mean, if you're an American, you voted for him because you wanted to see progress on ending the war in Ukraine. And now you see him over here talking about, oh, we're going to add more sanctions on Russia, as if that's going to magically turn the tide or force Putin to the negotiating table. How do you think that the American people are viewing Donald Trump and his rhetoric right now?
That's a good question. I think most Americans, remember, most Americans know very little about the outside world at all. I mean, that they want to see an American president standing up for America, standing tall, and I guess the world is full of bad guys that we need to be standing up against, and that's, I think, as far as it goes with the way most Americans view this, really comes down to whether behind that there's anything like a strategic vision, either with Mr. Trump or the people around him. There's some good guys out there like Alexander Mercouris and Gilbert Doctorow. I mean, people I know and I have the highest respect for, who are convinced that Trump is making a transition from a unipolar global American empire to a more limited national interest based regional power, that recognizes polarity, that recognizes that Russia, China, other places have a sphere of influence. I hope that's the case, but I don't see the indication of that yet. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, Greenland, Panama Canal, Gulf of America, absorb Canada, all that stuff, and say, okay, we're going to retreat into a Fortress America, Western Hemisphere, and then concede a sphere of influence to Russia, China, India, whoever. I can see maybe the first part, but I don't see the second part yet. I don't see Trump saying Middle East, Ukraine, West Pacific, Taiwan, none of our business. I don't see that yet. What I see, as I outline in the piece, is the idea he wants to somehow get out of Ukraine on the cheap, keep the Russians from winning a total victory, total collapse of Ukraine, while we go concentrate on, thumping the Iranians or confronting the Chinese or whatever. That's what seems to me is happening. But again, we're all guessing here, Rachel. I mean, we really don't know what goes on in the man's mind. Maybe he's not even sure what goes on in his own mind. And you've got this real mixed bag of scoundrels, some of whom are not so bad, some of whom are absolutely horrible in his administration. And it's a real witch's brew. We really don't know what's going on. And then it gets back to the other question: what are the other players going to do? What is she going to do? What is Putin going to do? Are they going to make an assumption they finally have somebody reasonable to talk to, or are they going to proceed with their own interests and hope at some point that Washington has to accept a fait accompli? That's what we don't know.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me too, because looking at someone like Donald Trump, who is all, America first, that's what he tries to project. But I think it's really hard at the end of the day for the US government to make America first actually happen, because they have this imperialist mindset, right? It's like they're like, we want Greenland and we want Canada. And it's like that mindset is still there no matter what. They can look at the rest of the country and go, we really need to focus on things here at home, right? The American people need our help, or they need the focus to be here on our own country. And they just seem to struggle with carrying that out. But I'm also curious too when it comes to Trump's cabinet, because he famously said that one of the biggest mistakes he made in his first term was surrounding himself with the wrong people. And then he goes and he starts choosing members for his second cabinet. And I'm sitting there going, you're doing it again, right? You're surrounding yourselves with the wrong people. You have, his new national security advisor, Mike Waltz. He thinks that we need to really turn up the pressure on Putin and on Russia, right? He was in favor of removing the restrictions on the use of long range weapons on Russia because he thought that that was going to force Putin to negotiate. So how do you see the position that Trump is in with the people around him? I know, talking about someone like Tulsi Gabbard, she may be a more sane voice in the room, I would certainly hope, but there are so many of those neocons around him. So what does that mean for his second term?
Again, it's we're obviously we're still early in the process. We really don't know. I said even during the campaign that Trump would not make the mistake of picking all the wrong people to staff his administration. He will pick different wrong people this time if he wins, which is essentially what he's done. I listened to Marco Rubio's confirmation speech at the Senate very carefully, and he did exactly what Mike Pompeo used to do, which is to take neocon globalist reality and dress it up in America First drag, and I think it's great. I think it's great news that Mike Pompeo got his security clearance stripped, and maybe Trump can wake up and see that in people once they've betrayed him. But then it seems that he picks then the same kind of wrong people and then he'll be surprised a few months down the road when he has exactly the same experience with them. Marco Rubio got, I think, unanimous approval by the Senate, whereas Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. are going to have a hell of a time getting confirmed. I hope they do. I think they might, but it's not going to be a sure thing. So I think it just shows what kind of a snake pit already is being created within the administration between people who I think are genuine America firsters, who I think understand, and I think RFK understands this, I think Tulsi Gabbard understands this, that the welfare and prosperity and peace of the American people is not consistent with global empire. That if we keep trying to pursue this unipolar domination of the entire globe, it's going to destroy us. It's already been destroying us. We've got to get out of the empire business. But I don't think Marco Rubio understands that at all. I don't think Mike Waltz understands. Sebastian Gorka, for crying out loud. So it's a real mixed bag. And where the president's mind is, I really don't know. I really don't.
Yeah, and that's almost the scary part. And I think that, with someone like Joe Biden, we knew where his mind was, right? We knew what he wanted out of Ukraine.
Such as
We knew
what?
his exactly. We knew his foreign policy so well, but with someone like Trump, he gives you a chance to hope, right? He gives you a chance to think, okay, maybe he's going to actually put America first. Maybe he's going to keep us out of World War III. And then he turns around and he, says one thing or does a different thing. And everyone's going, oh, okay, well, we were hopeful for a minute. So I obviously we don't know, but I'm also curious too, when it comes to where Russia stands in all of this, because we've heard Trump talking all week. We haven't heard directly from Russian President Putin. But what's notable to me is that there were multiple attacks by the US, maybe a few Ukrainian soldiers were involved, using long-range weapons on Russian territory at the end of Biden's term that Russia vowed it would respond to, but it has yet to do so. And the speculation at the time was kind of, okay, maybe they're waiting for Trump to come in. Maybe he's going to kind of smooth things over. But Are there concerns that Putin gets to the point where he's sick of listening to Trump put out these, threats and statements about Russia, and he decides, okay, we're going to respond? Oh, and then on top of that, Russia just unveiled this brand new Oreshnik new intermediate range ballistic missile. So, I mean, they have some different things that they could do if they really wanted to issue a response.
Yeah, that's right. It reminds me back. It's still under Biden, of course, when the ATACMS and the Storm Shadow missiles were used for long range strikes in Russian territory. And the Russians kept saying, if you do that, that means you're directly at war with the Russian Federation, that we're going to hold you responsible. And we're going to respond by, hitting the Ukrainians. Oh, you did it again. Well, we're going to respond at this time by hitting the Ukrainians. I mean, they've still promoted this notion that for the United States, for the British, for the French, striking on Russian territory is a freebie for them, because the only retaliation will be against targets in Ukraine, targets that, frankly, you would think they would be hitting in the normal course of the war anyway. So how is that exactly a retaliation? Now, you can say, well, thank goodness for their restraint. And a lot of people are saying that. And I can see that side of it, but I can also see where that encourages then irresponsible people in Washington and London and Paris and so forth, and especially, and maybe now in Berlin, if Mr. Merz becomes the next chancellor next month after the German election, to think that, hey, this is a risk-free proposition. We can sling whatever we wanted to in Russia, and they won't hit back at us. They'll just hit the Ukrainians some more, and who cares about them? More dead Ukrainians, who cares? So, I'm more concerned that the Russian restraint, as well reasoned as it is from their side, simply contributes to more escalation, and exactly the opposite of what they intend. And this is why I'm somewhat concerned about the mentality in Moscow, that they're reasonable people. They don't seem to really appreciate that they've been dealing with a bunch of lunatics on the other side who don't respond to caution and reason, and that they keep trying this kind of what I call a pedagogical approach. Let's be responsible, let's be limited, and at some point they'll see reality and come to talk to us, and we can finally make a deal. Although none of the deals ever made in the past have ever panned out, because the people they were making deals with were a bunch of liars who never intended to carry out their side of the deal. Will that change under Trump? I don't know. As you say, a subsequent administration may not keep any deal he makes. Will even his current administration be able to stick by a deal, especially since, if it's anything based on realism and where the things really stand on the ground in Ukraine, how's Congress going to go along with it? How can he get anybody in Washington to go along with it? I tend to think that the more responsible course of events from Moscow would be just to simply win the damn war in the Ukrainian state, and present Washington with a fait accompli. And at that point, they'll have to come to terms with it. Maybe NATO would not survive that. I hope NATO as an organization does not survive. It should have gone out of business in 1991. And I realize there's some risks associated with that, but holding out hope for a deal that is almost certainly going to be, I use the analogy of Charlie Brown kicking the football here, almost certainly going to be a deception. I can understand why Moscow is inclined in that direction, but I think in the long term, that's not only not in Russia's interest, but in America's interest or the interests of the world, to have yet another, what turns out to be a truce, a pause that Moscow says they won't accept, and will only set the stage for a bigger, worse war at some point in the future.
Yeah, and I know that that's something that Putin has brought up a number of times, right? Saying, look, we don't want to just freeze this conflict so that we can give NATO time to rearm Kiev and come back to this war in 20 years and go at it again. That's not what we want to do. And it's been interesting to watch it, because I think that obviously the United States approach to how they would have dealt with things in Ukraine is they would have gone in and taken out Zelensky, whoever the president was, on day one, right? But instead you have Russia in this place where they're looking at Kiev and they're going, okay, one of the big issues that we brought up here is the fact that there are all of these crazy right-wing extremist neo-Nazis. And so if we go in on day one and we take out Zelensky, they are going to wreak havoc, and there's never going to be a peaceful solution that way. So instead, they go about it this way, where they carry out this war of attrition. It is long, it is brutal, it is bloody, it comes at a cost to both sides. Not quite the cost to Russia's side that Trump seems to think there is, but there obviously is a cost. And when you look at the battlefield now, you are finally starting to see Russia gaining momentum, right? You're seeing Russian forces advancing in the Donbass. And so, as you were pointing out there, the possibility of saying, okay, Russia's just going to stick to the battlefield, stick to where they're going. Could you see that getting eventually all the way to where they are essentially either wiping out the Ukrainian state or wiping out a significant version of it, because you have Russia coming in and saying, okay, we need this cordon sanitaire, we need this buffer zone, because NATO has shown that they're not going to stop, and we have to have some level of security here. We've been voicing it for decades. No one has listened. So this is what it actually looks like on the ground.
Who has it said that Russia only has two allies, its army and its navy? That's all there is. And the idea that they somehow can make a deal and that will guarantee Russia's security and provide at least a minimum for stability in Europe. Even when, for example, in December 2021, when they sent those draft treaties over to Washington and to NATO and said, we want firm security guarantees. What would those guarantees be? A treaty? UN Security Council resolution? Those are just pie crusts to the people in Western capitals. They don't care about agreements like that. The rules-based international order does not care about the rule of law. And unless there are actually concrete developments on the ground, which can be accomplished militarily, but in my opinion, not politically and not diplomatically, even assuming Mr. Trump's best intentions, I don't think we're going to see that kind of stable end to this conflict. At best, what we might see from the West would be an attempt to put the conflict on hold while we go pursue Iran or go after the Chinese. And again, this gets back to the question: is there going to be a strategic shift in American policy where we don't care about those things anymore? I don't know if that has really occurred to them in Moscow. Look, I'm not saying they're dumb people; they're smart people, but I don't think they really understand the way the internal politics of the United States works and how the American establishment is like a big dumb dinosaur, kind of like the old Soviet nomenclatura, that really can't stop doing what it does. It can just keep day in, day out, pouring the water from one bucket into the other, as they've been patterned to do over decades, and they just don't know how to change course. So again, I'm cautiously pessimistic here. I'm not sure if the other thing that concerns me, and you mentioned Zelensky, is that Trump still seems to think in terms of, well, Putin and Zelensky have to talk and work this out.
Mm-hmm.
What's Zelensky? He's not even constitutionally the president anymore. He's just an actor. He's just a puppet for the CIA and MI6. And the Russians have, to their credit, made it clear that the only thing that matters is a dialogue between Washington and Moscow. Who cares about Zelensky? And you mentioned, of course, the various kind of neo-Nazi terrorist groups that really are the real force in Kiev. I don't know how you deal with those without a collapse of the Ukrainian state. So those people have no place to go. Let them go to Lvov. Let the Poles worry about them. But as long as there is any kind of a rump Ukrainian state that is not completely under Russian control, those people with guns are still going to be the ones running things in Kiev. And I don't see any two ways around that.
Yeah, and I think that Moscow is well aware of that. But yeah, exactly as you were saying, it's the question of, okay, do we want the nice, shiny deal that looks like it may be good in the short term? Or are we going to look long term and see where things go from here? Now, before I let you go, I wanted to ask you one more thing, because speaking of Zelensky, he's kind of kicking and screaming right now, trying to get attention. And his latest claim is that he is demanding 200,000 NATO troops as quote unquote peacekeepers, and he wants troops, including from the US, in Ukraine in order for there to be a deal. And I know that, when we look at the war in Afghanistan, the US clearly lost that, right? They just kind of stayed there long enough to where then they gave up and pulled out. But looking at the war in Ukraine, looking at everything that NATO has poured into it, all of the money, all of the weapons, all of the foreign mercenaries, how or where does the concern stand for them not wanting to give up, digging their heels in, and going further and further closer towards a possible World War III with Russia. Even now, when you have Trump in this position of saying, hey, let's make a deal, are there still serious concerns, especially for the EU and the UK, and how much they are willing to really get into this?
This is a critical point. Anatol Levin, again, another really, really bright guy, and I think somebody I linked to in my piece, said that there's no way the Russians will ever accept this, and he gives very good reasons for that. And again, I'm not quite so sure. I mean, Mr. Trump said something, I forget what he said, but something to the effect that Western peacekeepers, and I don't know if he included Americans in that or not, might be necessary to police a peace settlement. And of course, if the Russians actually thought they did have a peace settlement that guaranteed the neutrality of Ukraine, would they find some political formula where, well, maybe we could accept some kind of a peace force on the ground there? Maybe not European, maybe not American, maybe from the third world, maybe Indians or Middle Easterners or Africans or something. Again, none of this makes a whole lot of sense, but I could see where if they actually thought there was a peace agreement, some kind of a space might be created for a third force. I guess the question I have is, even if there's a guarantee of neutrality, a guarantee of no NATO membership for Ukraine, what happens then when the West, in my opinion, predictably violates those agreements and sends things into that rump Ukraine that are prohibited by whatever the peace agreement is? What are the Russians going to do? Say, oh, well, you violated the agreement. I guess we'll have to come in again. They're going to be very reluctant to do that. In other words, they have virtually no way to guarantee that agreement once it's signed. And as I say, almost certainly that agreement will be another deception. So I think people can swear on a stack of bishops at some point, oh, no, we will never accept these peacekeepers there. But I don't know if that's the case. And then when things fall apart, will those so-called peacekeepers turn into combatants? And that's, again, another one of those imponderables that we don't know till it actually happens. And do we really want to find out after the whole thing falls apart that the whole thing was not based on reality?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I know the false flag concerns around Ukraine have been there for
Mm-hmm.
years now, and certainly would be there if there was some kind of a deal, especially talking about all of those extremists that are still within the country that still want war and that want war with Russia. So certainly a lot at stake here and a lot that we have to continue to keep an eye on. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Jim Jatras, a geopolitical analyst and a former U.S. diplomat and GOP Senate foreign policy advisor. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you, Rachel. It's a pleasure, and I want to thank you for everything you do. Your voice out there is one of the most important ones, and I really appreciate it.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.